I took a deep breath and dialed the number. My fingers were shaking so hard I nearly dropped the receiver. The dial tone hummed in my ear like a steady heartbeat. 1 ring. 2 rings. Then a click. A voice answered. It was hesitant. It was familiar. It was him. I whispered that it had been a long time. I told him we still owed each other one more sunset. But as the silence stretched between us on the line, I realized the man on the other end wasn't the only ghost in the room. I looked at the photograph again. The light in the image was too perfect. The composition was too deliberate. I am a woman who has spent 62 years calculating risks and balancing ledgers. I know when a narrative is being sold to me. I looked at the envelope on the nightstand. I looked at the unruffled sheets on the other side of the bed. My heart wasn't just trembling. It was racing with the cold realization that every word in that note was a tactical maneuver. The silence of my house is a physical weight. It sits in the corners of the rooms like dust. It settles on the furniture. It gets into my bones. At 62, the world assumes you are finished. They see a grandmother. They see a widow. They see a line item that has reached its maturity date. My children call on a schedule. It is a quarterly report of their lives. Mom, how are you? Mom, did you take your vitamins? They don't wait for the answers. They are checking a box. They are fulfilling a fiduciary duty. My husband left me with a comfortable portfolio and a house that is too big for one person. He left me with a legacy of safety. But safety is just another word for a slow death. On the morning of my birthday, I woke up to a house that didn't know it was a special day. No cards on the mat. No notifications on the screen. Just the soft chirping of birds outside. It was a peaceful existence. It was an uneventful calm. It was a tomb. I sat by the window and watched the golden sunlight stretch across the empty street. I tracked the movement of the light like a surveyor. I knew exactly when it would hit the edge of the rug. I knew when it would fade into gray. I felt the loneliness then. It wasn't a sharp pain. It was a dull ache. It was the sound of a clock ticking in an empty hallway. I decided then that I would not spend the night as a ghost. I would find a pulse. I walked to the bus stop. The night bus into the city felt like a getaway car. I watched the outskirts of town blur into the neon glow of the metropolitan center. I was looking for something out of the ordinary. I was looking for a breach in the contract of my life. If you have ever felt like you were disappearing in plain sight, hit the like button so I know I am not alone in those shadows. The bar was tucked away in an alleyway. It was a low-light establishment. The air was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and floor wax. I chose a corner seat. It was a strategic vantage point. I wanted to see the room without being seen. I ordered a glass of red wine. The tannins hit my tongue with a sharp sweetness. It had been decades since I allowed myself the luxury of a clouded mind. I watched the patrons. Young professionals. Tired laborers. People looking for a connection or an escape. Then I saw him. He moved through the crowd with a practiced grace. He was in his early 40s. Gray hair at the temples. A thoughtful expression. He wasn't looking for a drink. He was looking for a target. He walked toward me. He smiled. He asked if he could buy me another. I laughed. I told him not to call me ma'am. I told him I wasn't used to it. I was lying. I was very used to it. But I wanted to be someone else for a night. Our conversation was a masterclass in rapport building. He told me he was a photographer. He spoke of light and shadow. He spoke of journeys to places I had only seen in magazines. I spoke of my youth. I spoke of the dreams I had deferred for the sake of stability. I felt a warmth I hadn't known in years. It wasn't just the wine. It was the validation. It was the feeling of being the center of someone's frame. He listened with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. But looking back, I see the technical precision of his interest. He was mirroring my body language. He was active listening. He was mining me for data. We left the bar together. The air outside was cool. The city felt alive. He took me to a hotel. I was intoxicated. I was vulnerable. I felt the comfort of his arms. I felt the weight of another human being. In the dim light of the hotel room, the world narrowed down to the space between us. I fell asleep feeling safe. I fell asleep feeling seen. The sunlight through the curtains was the first sign of the shift. It was too bright. It was too honest. I turned to say good morning, but the bed was empty. The pillow was cold. The space beside me was a vacuum. Then I saw the white envelope. My hands trembled as I opened it. The photograph inside was beautiful. I looked peaceful. I looked cared for. The note was a masterpiece of emotional engineering. He said he didn't do anything. He said he just watched me sleep. He said he wanted me to have one quiet night. It was a narrative of pure altruism. But then came the confession. He knew who I was. He knew me from his father's stories. He described his father as a shadow of a man. He pleaded for a reunion. He gave me a name and a number. It was a perfect circle. A lost love found through the intervention of a son. It was a story designed to bypass every cynical bone in my body. I sat in the silence of that hotel room and felt a strange tenderness. I looked at the photo again. The composition was professional. The lighting was curated. As a woman who has managed assets for 40 years, I began to look for the hidden costs. Why would a man spend his night watching a stranger sleep? Why would he leave a trail that led directly to a past I had buried? I thought about the house on the outskirts of town. I thought about the quiet street. I thought about the man who once loved me. The son had mentioned his mother passed away 2 years ago. He mentioned his father lived alone. I felt the pull of the past. I felt the desire to be a part of a story again. But there was a gap. A piece of the puzzle that didn't fit. The son was a photographer. The father was a shadow. And I was a woman with a very significant net worth and no one to leave it to. I returned home that afternoon. The house felt different. It felt like a stage set. I opened the old drawer. I found the worn address book. My fingers shook as I dialed. The voice on the other end was hesitant. "Hello," he said. "It's me," I whispered. "It's been a long time. Maybe we still owe each other one more sunset." He breathed out my name. He sounded like a man who had been waiting for a miracle. We talked for an hour. We talked about the years between us. We talked about his son. He spoke of him with pride. "A talented boy," he said. "A boy who takes care of his father." We agreed to meet. The late afternoon light spilled across my floor. For the first time in years, my heart felt light. I felt like life had handed me a second chance. But as I hung up the phone, I looked at the photograph one more time. I noticed something in the background. Something small. Something tucked away in the corner of the hotel room mirror. It was the reflection of a second camera. A tripod. A setup for a high-definition recording. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was a production. I began to look at my life through a different lens. I am a professional. I understand how systems work. I understand how narratives are constructed to move capital. I looked at the address book. I looked at the phone number. I didn't call him back that night. Instead, I called a private investigator I had used for estate matters. I gave him the name. I gave him the number. I gave him the son's description. I told him to find the connection. I told him to look for the debt. Because in my world, love doesn't just happen on your 62nd birthday when you are at your loneliest. In my world, everything has a price. And I needed to know if I was buying a sunset or if someone was trying to sell me the dark. The investigator called me back 3 hours later. He didn't have good news. He didn't have bad news. He had a file. A file that changed the way I saw the man I had loved 40 years ago and the son who had just tucked me into bed. The investigator cleared his throat over the line. He told me the son was not just a photographer. He was a professional skip tracer with a history of high-end asset recovery. He told me the father's house had been in foreclosure for 6 months. The timeline was a perfect match. The son had spent weeks tracking my movements and my routines. He knew which bus I took and which bar I preferred. He knew my husband's death had left me with a liquidity that few in this town could fathom. I sat in my kitchen and looked at the tile floor. It was a cold calculation. They weren't looking for a lost love. They were looking for a bailout. They were looking for a way to satisfy a massive lien on a property that had been in their family for generations. If you've ever felt the sting of realizing you were just a line item in someone else's budget, hit the like button so I can see who else has been played. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I felt a cold clarity wash over me. It was the same feeling I used to get in the boardroom when a vendor tried to hide a deficit in the fine print. I was 62 years old and I had been targeted for my vulnerability. They thought my loneliness was a weakness. They thought they could leverage my nostalgia for a quick infusion of cash. I looked at the number on the note. I realized the hesitation in the father's voice earlier wasn't love, it was a rehearsal. He was waiting for his cue. He was waiting for the mark to bite. I am a woman who knows how to manage a hostile takeover. I decided then that I would meet him for that sunset. But I wouldn't be arriving as the grieving widow or the lonely retiree. I would be arriving as the chairperson of the board. I spent the next morning at my desk. I pulled the deeds for the property. I looked at the credit reports. I saw the mountain of debt the father had accumulated after the mother passed away. Medical bills and bad investments. They were desperate. And desperation makes people sloppy. They left a paper trail a mile wide. I prepared a document of my own. It wasn't a love letter. It was a settlement agreement. I dressed with precision. I wore the suit I used to wear for closing deals. I drove to the park where we had agreed to meet. The sun was beginning its descent. The light was orange and heavy. It was the golden hour. The perfect time for a photographer to capture a moment. I saw them from a distance. The father sitting on the bench and the son standing a few yards away with a camera. They were waiting for the climax of their story. I walked toward them with a steady gait. My heels clicked on the pavement. The father stood up. He looked older than I remembered, but the eyes were the same. They were filled with a scripted warmth. He reached out his hands. He called my name. He said he had missed me every day for 40 years. It was a beautiful performance. I let him take my hands. I felt the sun's lens tracking us from the periphery. I let the silence hang for a moment. I let the sunset paint us in its deceptive glow. Then I leaned in close. I didn't whisper a sweet nothing. I told him I knew about the foreclosure. I told him I knew about the skip tracer license. I told him I knew exactly how much his son owed the bank. I felt his hands go cold in mine. The warmth in his eyes didn't just fade. It evaporated. The sun stopped filming. He lowered the camera. He didn't look like a soulful artist anymore. He looked like a man who had just seen his profit margin disappear. We sat on the bench. The three of us. The charade was over. The silence was no longer heavy with nostalgia. It was sharp with the reality of the situation. I opened my bag and pulled out the file. I told them I was prepared to buy the debt. I was prepared to pay off the house and clear the liens. I saw the spark of hope in the son's eyes. He thought he had one anyway. He thought the mark was so desperate for companionship that she would pay for the privilege of being lied to. But I wasn't finished. I told them there would be a cost. I don't give handouts. I make acquisitions. If you want to know what it feels like to own the people who tried to break you, stay with me. The contract I placed on the bench was simple. I would buy the house. I would hold the title. They would be allowed to live there as tenants at will. But they would work for me. The son would use his skills to manage my security and my interests. The father would be the companion he pretended to be. They had tried to trap me in a story of their making. I was simply rewriting the ending. I looked at the father. I asked him if he still loved me. He couldn't even look me in the eye. He looked at the paperwork instead. He looked at the numbers. He signed his name. The sun followed. The sunset was gone now. The streetlights flickered on. The golden hour was over and the cold blue of the night had arrived. I stood up and took the signed documents. I told them I would see them on Monday morning for their first briefing. I walked back to my car alone. My heart didn't feel light. It felt like steel. I was no longer the lonely woman by the window. I was the one holding the keys. The drive back to the outskirts of town was different this time. The engine hummed with a predatory efficiency. I watched the city lights recede in my rearview mirror like fading embers. I had spent 62 years playing by the rules of others. I had been a loyal wife and a selfless mother. I had been the reliable background character in everyone else's drama. But as I pulled into my driveway, I realized that the house was no longer a tomb. It was a headquarters. I walked through the front door and didn't bother turning on the lights. I sat in the dark and felt the weight of the signed contracts in my bag. I was the majority shareholder in their lives now. I had liquidated their freedom to secure my own. I looked at the photograph the son had taken of me. I realized now why I looked so peaceful in it. It wasn't because I was cared for. It was because for the first time in my life I was being truly observed. Even if it was through the scope of a hunter. Monday morning arrived with a cold precision. I didn't wait for them to call me. I sent a car to pick them up at 8 sharp. I had the dining room table cleared and set with 3 folders. When they walked into my home, they didn't look like the romantic leads from a birthday miracle. They looked like employees arriving for a performance review. The son was twitchy. He didn't have his camera to hide behind. The father looked smaller than he had at the park. He looked like a man who had realized that the woman he once loved had been replaced by something much more formidable. I didn't offer them coffee. I didn't offer them a seat. I stood at the head of the table and laid out the terms of our new reality. If you've ever had to take control of a situation that was spiraling out of your hands, hit the like button to show your strength. The son was the first to speak. He tried to reclaim the narrative. He told me he was sorry for the deception but that he did it for his father. He tried to sell me on the idea that the affection was real even if the circumstances were manufactured. I cut him off mid-sentence. I told him that in this house, we speak in the language of deliverables. I gave him his first assignment. He was to audit the security of my entire estate. I wanted to know every point of entry. I wanted to know every digital footprint I left behind. He was a tracer. He was a ghost. Now he would be my shield. He nodded slowly. The realization was sinking in. He wasn't a photographer anymore. He was a high-functioning asset on a very short leash. He left the room to begin his sweep. That left the father. He stood by the window where I used to sit and watch the birds. He looked out at the empty street. He asked me if I really hated him that much. I told him that hate requires an emotional investment I wasn't willing to make. I told him that he was a liability that I had decided to turn into a fixed asset. We weren't going to relive the past. We were going to manage the present. I told him his job was simple. He would be my social proxy. He would attend the functions I had avoided. He would be the face of my public life while I operated from the shadows. He was a man who knew how to charm. He was a man who knew how to lie. Those were skills I could finally put to professional use. The first month of our arrangement was a study in cold integration. The son lived in the guest house. He worked through the night. He installed cameras that tracked every movement on the perimeter. He encrypted my communications. He turned my quiet home into a fortress. He was efficient. He was silent. He was terrified of me. Every time he looked at me, I saw the same thought in his head. He was wondering how he had missed the iron beneath the velvet. He had researched my bank accounts, but he hadn't researched my soul. He had looked at the balance sheets, but he hadn't seen the decades of suppressed ambition. I watched him work on the monitors he installed in my office. I watched him become the shadow he had accused his father of being. The father was a different story. He struggled with the script. He wanted to talk about the old days. He wanted to talk about the night we met 40 years ago. He wanted to believe that there was still a spark of that girl left in the woman who now held his mortgage. I had to remind him of the price of his house every time he got too close. I had to remind him that our sunsets were now scheduled appointments. We went to a gallery opening in the city. He played his part perfectly. He held my arm. He smiled at the right moments. He told the stories I told him to tell. To the world we were a heartwarming story of late-life romance. A second chance found in the autumn of our lives. But under the table I was checking my watch. I was counting the minutes until the performance was over. One evening as we were driving back from a charity gala, the father turned to me. The car was dark and the city lights blurred past us. He asked me if I ever missed the quiet. He asked me if I ever missed the woman who sat by the window and felt lonely. I didn't answer him for a long time. I looked at the digital display on the dashboard. I looked at the security alerts popping up on my phone from the sun's latest sweep. I told him that loneliness is a luxury for those who have nothing to lose. I told him that I had never been more alone than I was that night at the bar. But now I wasn't alone. I was occupied. I was busy. I was in control. And control is a much better companion than hope. The gap in the story appeared on a Tuesday. The son came into my office without knocking. He looked pale. He had been monitoring my husband's old accounts as part of his security sweep. He found a series of recurring payments that didn't make sense. Payments that had been going out for 20 years to a holding company in the Cayman Islands. A holding company that was recently liquidated. He told me that the money hadn't just disappeared. It had been moved. And the person who authorized the transfer used my biometric signature to do it. But I hadn't touched those accounts in years. I looked at the screen. I looked at the sun. I realized then that the trap I thought I had closed was much larger than I ever imagined. The sun wasn't the only one who had been watching me. I stood up and walked to the window. The golden light was stretching across the street again. It looked the same as it had on my birthday. But the world felt different. I turned to the sun and told him to find the destination of that money. I told him to trace it back to the source. He asked me what I thought it was. I told him I didn't think. I knew. My husband hadn't just left me a portfolio. He had left me a puzzle. And I was starting to suspect that the man I had slept with on my 62nd birthday wasn't the first person to try and sell me a lie. If you want to know what happens when the past starts to fight back, don't go anywhere. The next section of the ledger is about to be opened and the numbers are finally starting to add up. The son's fingers flew across the keyboard. The mechanical click sounded like gunfire in the small office. He was sweating. The professional skip tracer was finally out of his depth. He told me the biometric signature wasn't a digital forgery. It was a perfect match for my retina and my thumbprint. But the timestamp on the transfer was from 2 a.m. on the night I was at the hotel. While I was dreaming of sunsets and second chances, my entire legacy was being redirected into a ghost account. I looked at the sun. I looked at his expensive equipment. I asked him if he was the one who did it. He stopped typing. He looked at me with a fear that was finally genuine. I walked out of the office and found the father in the living room. He was holding a glass of scotch and looking at an old photo album. I took the glass from his hand and dashed the contents into the fireplace. The flames flared blue and green. I asked him who else knew about our history. I asked him who gave his son the idea to target me in that specific bar on that specific night. He looked confused. He looked pathetic. But beneath the confusion I saw a flicker of the old charm. He told me that he hadn't spoken to anyone about me in years. Except for his lawyer. He said he had to list all potential creditors and associates when the foreclosure started. He mentioned a name. A name I hadn't heard since my husband's funeral. A man named Miller. Miller had been my husband's fixer. He was the man who handled the offshore accounts and the delicate legalities of a high-net-worth life. He was the one who told me the estate was settled. He was the one who handed me the keys to a life of quiet isolation. If you have ever realized that your entire reality was a curated exhibit designed to keep you distracted, hit the like button right now because the walls are starting to crumble. I realized the sun hadn't found me by accident. He had been tipped off. He was the distraction. He was the bait used to get me out of the house and into a hotel room where my biometrics could be harvested while I slept in a wine-soaked haze. The sun wasn't the mastermind. He was the expendable labor. I told the son to get in the car. I told the father to stay in the house and not to touch the phone. We drove back toward the city. The speed was dangerous but the car was stable. I told the son to find Miller's current location. He tracked the cell signal to a private airfield on the north side of the city. We arrived just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The airfield was a patch of gray asphalt surrounded by tall grass. A small Gulf Stream was idling on the tarmac. I saw a black sedan parked near the hangar. I saw a man standing by the boarding stairs. It was Miller. He looked exactly the same as he did 10 years ago. He looked like a man who never had a restless night in his life. I didn't wait for the sun to open my door. I stepped out into the wind and the smell of jet fuel. Miller saw me. He didn't run. He didn't look surprised. He smiled. He checked his watch. He told me I was 20 minutes early. He said he expected the sun's amateur tracking to take a little longer. I walked up to him until I could see the reflection of the runway lights in his glasses. I asked him why. I asked him why he waited 10 years to drain the accounts. He told me it wasn't about the money. He said the money had been his for a long time. It was about the closure. He said my husband had a final instruction in his will. A contingency plan. If I ever became restless. If I ever tried to step out of the quiet life that had been built for me. The instruction was simple. The moment I sought a connection outside of the pre-approved circles, the estate was to be liquidated and moved to a trust Miller controlled. My husband hadn't left me a legacy of safety. He had left me a cage with a motion sensor. The son's arrival at the bar wasn't the breach of the contract. It was the trigger for the trap. Miller thanked the son for his service. He pulled a thick envelope from his coat pocket and tossed it onto the pavement. The son looked at the money. He looked at me. He looked at the life he could save with that envelope. He didn't hesitate. He picked it up. He didn't look back as he walked toward the black sedan. I was alone on the tarmac with the man who had just stolen my life. Miller boarded the plane. The stairs retracted. The engines began to roar. I stood there as the jet began to taxi away. I felt the heat of the exhaust. I felt the vibration in the ground. I had no house. I had no money. I had no family who cared to call. I was 62 years old and I had been stripped down to the bone. I watched the plane take off and disappear into the dark sky. I stood in the middle of the empty airfield and I didn't feel the weight of the silence anymore. I felt a strange lightness. The cage was gone because the prize inside was no longer worth guarding. I started walking. I didn't walk toward the car. I walked toward the gate. I reached the main road and started walking toward the city. My heels were broken. My suit was stained with oil. I looked like a woman who had lost everything. But as I walked, I started to laugh. It wasn't the laughter of a broken mind. It was the laughter of a woman who had just been handed the ultimate freedom. I had spent my life balancing ledgers and managing risks. I had spent my life being a person of interest. Now I was a person of no consequence. I was a ghost. And ghosts can go anywhere. I found a diner near the edge of the city limits. I walked inside and sat at the counter. The waitress looked at me with a mix of pity and annoyance. She asked me what I wanted. I looked at the menu. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3 a.m. I told her I wanted a coffee and a map. She brought the coffee. I didn't have any money to pay for it. I reached into my pocket and found the only thing I had left. It was the photograph the sun had taken of me. The one where I looked peaceful. The one where I looked cared for. I handed it to her. I told her it was a work of art. I told her it was worth more than a cup of coffee. She looked at the photo. She looked at me. She saw the woman in the light and the woman in the shadows. She set the photo down and told me the coffee was on the house. I took a sip. It was hot. It was bitter. It was the first thing I had tasted in years that wasn't a lie. I opened the map and started to plan my next move. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the audit. I traced the lines on the map with a fingernail that was jagged and chipped. The waitress moved away to serve a trucker at the far end of the counter. I wasn't looking for a destination. I was looking for a vulnerability. Miller thought he had won because he held the capital. He thought I was a creature of comfort who would wither without a padded bank account and a quiet garden. He forgot that I was the one who built those accounts. I was the one who navigated the regulatory minefields while my husband played at being a mogul. I knew every shell company. I knew every digital backdoor we had installed in the 90s when the internet was still a wild frontier. I didn't need a login. I needed a terminal. If you've ever been underestimated by a man who thought he owned the room, hit the like button and watch how I take it back. I left the diner as the first hint of gray light touched the horizon. I didn't head for the residential districts. I headed for the industrial sprawl where the data centers hummed behind windowless concrete walls. I found an all-night internet cafe used by gamers and transients. I paid for an hour with a gold ring I slipped from my finger. The manager didn't ask for ID. He didn't care who I was. I sat at a terminal in the back corner. My fingers felt stiff. My eyes were burning. But the muscle memory was still there. I didn't go for the money. That would be too easy to track. I went for the infrastructure. I began to ping the servers of the holding company in the Caymans. I looked for the ghost entries I had hidden there 20 years ago as a private insurance policy against my husband's volatility. The code was still there. It was ancient but functional. It was a logic bomb designed to detonate if the accounts were ever fully liquidated without a secondary authorization code. Miller had been so eager to flee that he hadn't checked the plumbing. He had moved the money into a central hub. My hub. I didn't move the funds back to myself. I moved them into a high-frequency trading algorithm I had scripted in a moment of boredom a decade ago. I set the parameters to aggressive. I watched the numbers begin to churn. I wasn't just stealing the money back. I was using Miller's stolen capital to short the very companies he had invested his own fortune in. I was using his leverage to break his back. I walked out of the cafe as the sun finally broke over the city. I was exhausted, but my mind was a razor. I had no home to return to and no family to call. I was 62 years old and I was currently the most dangerous ghost in the financial sector. I found a public park and sat on a bench. A few yards away, a young mother was pushing a stroller. She looked at me and saw a homeless woman in a ruined suit. She saw a tragedy. I saw a disguise. I pulled a burner phone I had purchased with the last of my jewelry and dialed the father's number. He answered on the first ring. His voice was a wreck. He asked me where I was. He asked me if I was okay. I told him to listen carefully. I told him the house was gone but the debt was about to be irrelevant. I told him the son had made a choice. He had taken the envelope and he had walked away. I told the father that he had a choice now too. He could go back to being a shadow in a foreclosed house or he could help me finish the audit. I needed a face. I needed someone who could walk into a bank and sign a physical document without triggering a security alert. I needed the man who had lied to me to finally tell one truth. There was a long silence on the line. I watched the birds chirping in the trees. I watched the golden sunlight stretch across the grass. It was a peaceful moment. It was a beautiful day. The father finally spoke. He asked me what I wanted him to do. I gave him an address in the city. I told him to meet me there in 2 hours. We met in front of a glass tower that housed the regional headquarters of the bank Miller used. The father looked like he hadn't slept. He looked at me and his eyes filled with tears. He started to apologize. He started to explain. I stopped him. I told him that the past was a closed book. We were in the epilogue now. We walked into the lobby. I stood behind him like an assistant. I whispered the instructions into his ear. He spoke to the manager. He presented the documents I had printed at the cafe. He signed the forms. He authorized the transfer of the holding company's remaining assets into a newly formed charitable foundation. A foundation with no board of directors and no physical address. A foundation that would distribute the funds into thousands of untraceable microgrants across the globe. By noon, Miller's accounts were empty. His jet was likely landing in a country that would soon receive an international warrant for his arrest based on the evidence I had leaked to the authorities from the cafe. I had burned it all down. The house. The legacy. The safety. I walked out of the bank and stood on the sidewalk with the man I had loved 40 years ago. He asked me what we would do now. He asked me if there was anywhere left to go. I looked at the street. It was busy and loud and chaotic. It was full of people who didn't know who I was. I felt a lightness in my chest that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with space. I had finally cleared the clutter. I told him I was going to buy a bus ticket. I told him I was going to see the journeys I had once dreamed of taking. He asked if he could come with me. I looked at him. I saw the gray in his hair and the calm expression that had once tricked me into feeling safe. I saw the man who had tried to con me and the man who had eventually stayed. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I started walking toward the station. He fell in step beside me. We didn't hold hands. We didn't talk about sunsets. We just walked. The sun was high in the sky now. The light was harsh and uncompromising. It showed every wrinkle and every scar. It was the truth. And for the first time in 62 years, I wasn't afraid to look at it. As we reached the terminal, I saw a young man standing by the ticket counter. It was the son. He was holding the envelope Miller had given him. He looked lost. He looked like he had realized that the money wasn't enough to buy back his soul. He saw us and he froze. I didn't stop. I didn't acknowledge him. I walked past him and bought 2 tickets for the next bus heading west. I handed one to the father. We boarded the bus and took seats in the back. As the engine started, I looked out the window. I saw the city begin to move past. I saw the outskirts of town. I saw the life I had left behind. I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the glass. I wasn't waiting for a second chance. I was already living it.
Have a story like this? Send it to us, and we'll share it with the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more true family drama. Thanks for watching.